hosting today's session, and we will take Q&A questions after the presentation, so feel free to submit those in the Q&A tab. I'm glad to welcome Katasi Kulubya, who will present inclusive enterprise product experiences. Welcome to the stage, Katasi.
Thank you, Irina. So happy to be here.
We too.
All right. And so with that, I guess I'll go ahead and share my presentation and get started. All right. So hello, everyone. And thank you for joining me today. I am so excited to be here and to be speaking as one of the big picture talks. And so today I'll be sharing my perspective on inclusive design and how we can apply it to the enterprise product experience. So let's begin by taking a look at these 12 diversity dimensions that are fundamental to inclusion. When it comes to ease of use in product design, certain dimensions come to mind first because they seem the most obvious. For example, focusing on ease of use for people who are hard of hearing or visually impaired. Considering the less obvious dimensions, the ones probably closer on the right of the diagram, considering these less obvious dimensions and their impact on ease of use may not be as clear. So let's take me as an example. What are my diversity dimensions and how do they have an impact on my product experiences? So a quick intro of who I am and the dimensions that make me who I am. Here's a quick snapshot of who I am personally. In terms of diversity dimensions, you could say that I'm a pretty unique blend. For example, I'm first generation American and both of my parents are immigrants. They come from two different countries, speak two different languages, and have very different cultural backgrounds, which have shaped my own personal culture. And as you can see, there are some other additional diversity dimensions that make me who I am, and that are probably very similar or different from each of you. Now let's, look over to the professional me, and this is probably the person that you've seen prior to hopping on this call. This is almost like my LinkedIn profile, if you will. I'm a senior designer at Google. I've been practicing UX for the last 10 years, and I'm also a UX instructor outside of work. And so if I were to compare myself to the designer that I was 10 years ago, my ability to understand and apply design and my skills are far superior than who I was. They're drastically different, and therefore my ease of use when it comes to UX products is also significantly different. So that's just to speak to that experience and seniority dimension. Now that you know a little bit about me and which dimensions, kind of reflect who I am, I now want to share some specific examples of products that were designed with inclusion in mind that have had a positive impact on my life. Here are two images that represent inclusive skin tones for undergarments on the left and Band-Aids on the right. Little story, gonna take myself down memory lane. Growing up, I have really specific memories of close female friends and family members, most of whom who had fair colored skin or white skin, suggest that I wear nude color bras. For them, it was just the right thing to do. You don't want anything dark showing under white clothes. It's just sort of one of those dress code 101 things, right? But what I came to find was that for me, the color that actually showed the least under white garments was black. And it's because that was closer to my skin tone. By no fault of their own, my friends, close family friends, family members and friends, unintentionally excluded race from their suggestion because the color nude, only until recently, and still is not really the case, has been synonymous with light skin. Having skin that is close to the color nude meant that they never had to consider alternatives, but I did. As a lifelong athlete, from high school and into college, I played basketball. I love the gear, from the dry fit technology socks to the shorts, and especially, without a doubt, basketball shoes. I'm a bit of a sneaker freak, if you will. And so when it came to shoes, I would always shop in the men's section, hands down. Why? Because if you go to the men's section, it's almost like this, this common thing that there's going to be a bigger selection, better technology and traction on the shoes, and just better design. You don't get the stereotypical pink and purple sneaker. And so you could tell they paid attention to how their products actually performed. And my other female teammates would often do the same thing because they couldn't find what they were looking for in the women's section. Why is this the case, you might wonder? Well, in the sports industry, only until recently, the assumption for decades has been that women are more interested in athletic gear being fashionable over functional. Why is that the case? Well, again, the assumption that women don't need high performance products because we don't really exert ourselves as much as men, which we know is a complete myth. And so today, companies like Nike and other big brands are changing this narrative and actually including women who are currently or have been high performing sports athletes into those decisions and into the design process. And now I can confidently shop in the women's section knowing that I will see a variety of products that I'll love. So those two examples give you a clear sense of not only who I am and the diversity dimensions that represent who I am, but more importantly, products that have resonated with me, inclusive products that have resonated with me, and the value of that. And so I want us to, before I get into this talk and talk about inclusion as it relates to enterprise design, I want to start with this question. Which diversity dimensions are we unintentionally excluding in our work today? We all have our own privileges, implicit biases. I know I do as well. And so the key is we have to ask ourselves, number one, what are those biases and privileges, and step out of that and really proactively consider people who are not like us and expand the way we think about how they use our products. So now that we know a little bit about inclusive design, what is an enterprise product experience? I'm kind of leading in with the assumption that everybody knows what this means, but let me get into that a little bit. Just to put it simply, enterprise products are tools that help us do our job. And so for UX designers, think Figma, Sketch, InVision, Adobe XD. For developers, think GitHub or any cloud computing software or console like AWS or even Google Cloud. There are even some tools, softwares, right, that border between personal and enterprise, like Gmail or Google Docs. And as far as the end user's motivation, I like to say, this is really what differentiates the consumer experience from the enterprise experience. It's the motivation. And the motivation comes down to three key areas, three themes. The first is productivity. How productive can I be at my job? The second is how easily you can collaborate. How easily can I communicate with my coworkers and get things done? The third is awareness. How easily can I see what's happening across my team? And so let's break this down even further and talk about some examples of features that I'm sure we're probably all familiar with as it relates to all three. Productivity could be a task management list or even your inbox. A collaboration feature could be for messaging, video conferencing, or even commenting in a shared doc. Awareness could be a dashboard, pretty much any data visualization, a notification, or even an activity feed to see what your teammates are doing. In summary, an enterprise is about enabling users to get their job done and to feel good about the outcome across all of these three areas. And so now let's combine the two. Those diversity dimensions, which ones are commonly applicable to the enterprise product experience? Well, in my experience, not to say that word so many times, in my experience working at Disney and at Google, I've found that these 5 dimensions are the most relevant. Now, let me get into why before we talk about the second part of this. So at Disney, just to take you down memory lane, I designed a platform called Harmony, and Harmony is used by the Disney Music Group organization to streamline their finance and music production workflows. We had to proactively consider the international teams that would be using the platform and also the international music data that this platform would contain. For example, song titles and artist names that were in different languages written in longer character lengths. And so that was how we addressed geography and language. Another important consideration was the level of music industry knowledge and familiarity that each Disney employee had with the music library, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is massive, right? From Pixar to Marvel to all of their acquisitions. And so that was how we addressed experience and seniority through our design. And lastly, age and ability. I feel like ability is honestly where we always think is how we think of inclusive design just generally. And so, which is incredible. But so that is definitely was by default, right? Making sure that the color contrast is efficient, that it meets the requirements, and that you can adjust type size. And of course, if you think about data intensive views and data tables, is that information readable, right? Are those views flexible and responsive? And currently at Google, I work with product teams to improve the Cloud Console experience, which is primarily used by developers all over the world. I find that some of the considerations used in designing the Disney Enterprise platform are very relevant to cloud in the same way. Number one, our international developers use the console in a variety of languages. About 30% use the console in different translations, and that number is growing. And they also read cloud technical documentation in other languages as well. So needing to addressing that proactively. The second is, we also have to make the console usable for differing levels of cloud computing knowledge and even just development, right? We have founders, we have business users, let's say from Spotify, who are using the console, and they too need to understand how to work their way around it to scale their business. Age and ability, similarly, we are considering how users are vision and mobility impaired, and how users who are vision and mobility impaired might use the console with a screen reader. And also because we have customers who are within the education and government sector, we also need to be ADA compliant in order to work with them. So this brings me back to those dimensions, right? So I mentioned before I talked about Disney and Google that those top 5 are the most relevant. So now this is where it gets exciting. The work that I'm doing today and the work that I'm most excited about is trying to figure out how all of these dimensions apply to enterprise, because this is the conversation that most of us are not having. Most of the time, I get the maybe these aren't relevant to the enterprise space. But this is what begs the question, are we unintentionally excluding users based on these dimensions that I've highlighted, right? How are these dimensions relevant to the enterprise space? Maybe there's an opportunity for us to bridge the gap between, oh, this is only used for my job and this is only the job version of me, or to actually meeting some human needs along the way. What might that look like? So I want to share, I think the big point of these talks is to share some takeaways that all of you can apply to your work. And so I want to share takeaways for how we can start addressing less obvious dimensions in enterprise product experiences. I want to begin with inclusive research and testing methods. So one important element of research, if not the most important, is recruiting, right? Recruiting the participants that you will speak to in your research. Our typical recruiting process tends to go something like this. If you have a sample that is made up of mostly men, you instinctively try to find more women to even things out. Or if you have a mostly young participants, you want to broaden the age range, right? You try to even out so you have a sample across one of the dimensions, each of the dimensions, right? The problem with that is that you fail to consider the intersectionality of that sample. So let me give you an example. You might have a mixed group of men and women across different ages and even races. But what if that entire group has the same exact socioeconomic status? And what if that entire group has the same ability, right? They all have the same abilities, they're able-bodied. At that point, truly how diverse is that sample? And so even looking at this example that I'm showing you here, right? Data collected from a 50-year-old Black Jamaican business owner who is partially sighted may differ significantly from data collected from a 20-year-old Black American engineering student who is sighted, even though they're considered to be of the same race and gender. So here's a great example of going beyond just race and gender. You know, it's not enough just to say, oh, we recruited 2 Black women. That should be enough representation. You've got to look a little bit deeper. The next little takeaway I want to share is about culture. So I'm sure that on that 12 dimensions, you saw the word culture and you said, okay, well, how do I apply that to my work? Well, I found this really incredible framework by a psychologist by the name of Geert Hofstede, and it helps explain the differences between cultures based on geographical location. And so there are 6 dimensions total, and I want to share 3 of them, but I highly encourage you all to kind of look through this deck after and just look up the 6. The first is power distance, which is the degree for authority and rank. High power distant cultures tend to accept hierarchical order and the inequalities that come with it. Low power distance cultures usually try to equalize the distribution of power. And so I'm sure the light bulb is going off that the US is more on the side of low power distance culture. Now let's say you're testing the usefulness of information between 2 users. User A comes from a high power distant culture. User B comes from a low power distant culture. The level of trust on the validity of that information might differ between the 2 users because of this dimension. User A might have a more positive reaction to the validity of the information because of the level of trustworthiness that they have for authority in comparison to user B. Individualism versus collectivism. This is the second dimension that I find to be interesting, and we could tie it to our designs. This measures the degree to which a person focuses on their own needs versus the needs of a group. So you're either an E person or a we person. So let's take the cloud marketplace feature as a great example, right? In the cloud marketplace, developers can shop for any products that meet their needs for cloud services. User A, who's from an individualist culture, is likely to take more initiative and act upon their own needs and do the research on their own and figure out which product is best for them. User B, who comes from a collectivist culture, would likely take a first stab at seeing what is most popular, what's everybody else saying, what are the testimonials, and making a decision based on the collective consensus. And the third one, and again, there's 6, but I just wanted to focus on these 3, masculine versus feminine, right? And masculinity in a culture leans more towards achievement and material success, whereas femininity leans more towards relationships and caring for others. The US falls somewhere between masculinity and femininity, depending on where you are and what industry you are in. For example, if you are in finance or an automotive industry, and even likely healthcare, those tend to be more masculine in their comparison because they emphasize the quality of the product and value, the high value for technical information. So why do we care? So I find this to be so fascinating because if we look at these dimensions across different countries, it's really fascinating because this really sheds light on if we were to do research and let's say gather data from 4 participants across China, India, the United Kingdom, and the United States, we can see that if we even just zero in on power distance, that our participants from the United States are likely to have similar views around power distance to those of the United Kingdom, but then drastically different views in terms of power distance in comparison to China and India. I say this because let's say there is a survey and I'm trying to collect information on the sentiment of a feature, right? Rank this feature on a scale from 1 to 10. Very poor, really great. Even that phrasing is very American, but right, let's say I do that. And then I get an 8 from all the participants. What does that 8 actually mean? Does it mean the same thing? Or is it different depending on where you are from and what your values are? Overall, this framework, the takeaway is that this framework is incredibly useful in just getting a sense for what motivates your end users. And I highly recommend it if you want to not only gather research from participants globally, but even domestically, because we all live in a very multicultural world. The second thing, just to close this off, is still relates to culture. And these are cross-cultural expressions. And this is a framework by Aaron Myers. And this is all about understanding on one axis how confrontational a country or a culture might be in comparison to the other axis, which is measuring the degree to which these cultures or countries are emotionally expressive. Now, if you happen to be from any of these countries or know somebody close to you who's from these countries, they might resonate with you. But again, I don't want to generalize. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. For me personally, I resonated with this chart because I am Filipino on my mother's side, and I was actually just there last year before COVID, thank God. And when I connect with that side of my family, you know, my mom, my aunt, they are very polite, warm, generally friendly. And there's also a collective sense of agreement. Filipinos, from my perspective, are generally agreeable in conversation. And so how that might translate to if I were to be conducting research with Filipino participants in comparison to participants in the US, there might be, right, I'm not going to make this huge assumption here, but there might be, they might be more cautious in giving negative feedback, right? Versus a culture that might be the opposite and more confrontational and more direct. So now let's take a look at inclusive enterprise ideation examples, AKA design. I'm sure that you're all sort of waiting for this moment. In the tech space, code bases and documentation have always contained words such as master, slave, whitelist, blacklist. This may come as a shock, or you may have already known this and seen this in code. And what's really amazing today is that companies are making stronger efforts to not only remove these words, but to replace them with words that we can scale, with words that other tech companies can also use, and that makes sense. And so Slack has created a bot that not only emphasizes these new recommended replaced words in tech, but that also discourages the use of non-inclusive language in general across the conversations you have with your team. So in this screenshot that I am showing here, the bot essentially holds everyone accountable by publicly replying to any non-inclusive word in the moment. And so definitely holds people accountable because it's public, but it also provides those recommendations. And it's not a person, right? So there isn't this feeling of, oh, this person's calling me out. So I just found it to be very clever, inclusive enhancement in the enterprise space. The next example, and this I won't spend too much time on, it's, I love this. Any opportunity that you have to plug in more inclusivity when it comes to ethnicity, race, gender, age, and just reflecting humans as they truly are in our enterprise tools. Like I said, oftentimes it's like, it might be that little bit of delight because we might not think it's relevant when you're working, but it actually might just be that extra step of delight and happiness in our day-to-day at work if we can just see an avatar who looks like us. And the next one I want to focus on is inclusive writing, because I think that this is definitely this is the area that we're exploring the most today, because again, most of our enterprise tools are data heavy, information heavy, right? I want to emphasize this because I feel like there's a strong need for simply just clarity in the way that we communicate with our writing, right? Clarifying details, using less jargon, using less industry slang, technical words, and providing helpful copy instead of just, oh, something happened that's wrong. And I feel like this not only touches on the language dimension, but it does also touch on the cultural dimension. Again, thinking of the cross-cultural language that truly is inclusive for everyone, for someone who might not be a native English speaker, for example. This one is also sort of a piggyback on the last example. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Smart Compose AI. And so not only does it help you be more productive and write emails faster, communicate more efficiently, but again, if you're a non-native English speaker, somebody like my mom, it's those little differences that feel more inclusive. If you're typing the word peace, and there are two different ways to spell peace with EA versus IE, and just making, allowing this, just automated way of just seeing, oh, this is how you should be spelling that word, I think is incredibly powerful. And it also encourages education as well. And dare I say, confident communication for everyone. Another great example that I notice, and I see this all the time in my work, is the Google Workspace tool, which it's basically just a flag, right? So that level of awareness of knowing, okay, this colleague is outside of my working hours. Maybe I shouldn't send them an invite to this event happening at this time. So just that simple, flag is really incredible and just allows for more inclusive, a more inclusive work culture for folks who live in different time zones. And lastly, this one, I want to share, again, I probably said culture several times. I also want to talk about work culture, right? Oftentimes with our enterprise tools, Monday, for example, which is a project management tool, even Cloud, right? We're offering tools for developers all over the world across different industries. And so working for a variety of different industries means that you've got to connect with those end users from different industries and help them see themselves and see their company in your product. It can't just be a catch-all, oh, here's this enterprise tool that works for everybody. And so I love examples where I see how Monday.com even has education and tutorials that even go down to use cases for different types of industries, all the way down to their examples for how they have features for automated notifications, and they specify when a shoot date arrives and pre-production is done, notify someone. So really just kind of, again, those delightful moments of embedding actual industry examples. I think that's also really special and inclusive to work culture. And so in closing, I want to emphasize that in those last set of examples, I'm sure you noticed, there aren't many enterprise examples that demonstrate cross-dimensional inclusion. And that's what I'm really excited about. And that is what I want to leave all of you getting excited about as well. This is uncharted territory. Most of us, when we think of inclusion, we think of the consumer space. And so that's what I'm going to do right after this call. That's what I'm excited about most. And so I want to leave you all with these 12 dimensions again, and think, how can I chart that, also start on that uncharted territory as well, and consider dimensions that nobody else is considering, because I guarantee you there is an unmet need, and it's going to be not only very impactful for the business, but for a user group that's just so unique, and they're going to be so happy. And it's, again, like those two examples that I shared in the very beginning, it's going to be amazing. And that's what we do as designers. So I hope that I gave you some tools, some inspiration to how to think about this work differently. And we can move on to Q&A. And if you're too shy to ask me a question, I'm only a message away on LinkedIn. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katasi. I hope you all enjoyed this amazing presentation. So now, if somebody have questions, please go to Q&A tab and write them there. For now, I don't see nothing, but let's wait a few minutes, maybe somebody will create something.
And thank you, everyone, for the comments as well.
It was really, very interesting.
Great. I think that's the goal, I think, we can listen to a lot of talks. I just hope that I inspired and shared something interesting and different.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe, oh, I see the question, so I will postpone mine. Okay. Okay, looking at the diversity dimensions, I don't see anything about emotional health psychiatric diagnosis. Is
Mm.
it covered under ability?
Yes, absolutely. I love that you brought this up, right? Because ability addresses cognitive ability. And I would say that that's what it falls under, right? We have vision, we have mobility, we have cognitive. And cognitive is, I would say, one of those uncharted territories, absolutely, because you have, um, you know, information processing, right? You have dyslexia, you have ranges when it comes to uh, somebody who might be autistic, and so that is absolutely work that needs to be done. And so, yes, to answer your question, it's an ability, but I almost would love for, maybe I'll work on this next, to almost like create subdimensions of these parent dimensions also for more, so that it's more clear. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Yes, let me check. I would like to ask about the maybe smaller companies. So what do you think, how we can, as a designers or developers or managers, how we can implement this approach, how we can advocate for it in the companies who are not thinking about this right now or before?
Absolutely. Such a good question. And pretty much what I'm doing at Google today. So it all comes down to the money, it all comes down to the dollar bills. So you got to prove why there is a business case for this, right? I think it's very easy to understand the human case, but if you can gather data or do an audit or show that there's a gap that needs to be filled. So let's say, I'm so bad at examples on the spot, so let me just not commit to that. If you find that there's a certain user group, or let's say 2 or 3 dimensions, where the data shows that you're not engaging with them, or the data shows that, oh, you know what, we're not addressing these users, but I think more importantly, you're not engaging. So I would start with getting data on who you're recruiting currently, who you're talking to, and then also simultaneously looking at the market opportunity. So is that specific group growing? Like, is there, a large growth for mobile users in India, or in other, countries all over the world, and you see that there is a surge in mobile opportunity, and we're not talking to those end users and gathering their needs. So what you do is you find the need in the recruiting, and you also map that to a market opportunity, and you present that, and you say, this, we're not addressing the needs of these end users, this yields this specific business opportunity, and therefore now we're going to do the work to actually validate that and you know increase revenue. So when it comes down to getting the buy-in from the top, you have to make it map to market opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds great. That's so true. Okay. Okay, people, do you have any questions?
And thank you for sharing that link for Slackbot. Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, that's really great.
I think that's probably like the best example, and that's what I wanted to leave with everyone, is that, there are many, but that is a solid example that addresses inclusivity, not only in the products, but also in the process and in the conversations happening on your team, right? Because that's the other side of it, is how inclusive is your team, and the way that you converse and collaborate with each other, and that feeds into the work you do as well.
Yeah, that's true. Because everything starting from us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One more question. So, how have you navigated pushback when you advocate for inclusivity?
And so to ask that one more time, what do I do when there is pushback?
How sorry, how have you navigated pushback when you advocate for inclusivity?
Right. So the pushback, I would say, comes down to, why do we need to prioritize this? I have all these other things that I need to be doing. Let's say we're talking about more more inclusive frameworks around research, or designing to make sure that that our components are tagged with the right ARIA label for screen readers, right? There's always the pushback because it's more effort, supposedly. So it's a very interesting question, because I honestly don't think it's a lot more work. I think it's just the expectation that it's a lot more work. And it's like, again, if you sort of realize that. So I think how I approach that is you really just have to find your way to not introduce it in a way that's like, okay, here's a list of all of these things you need to do. You have to sort of do baby steps and sort of implement it in small ways. And so, as I mentioned, when it comes to labeling your UI so that a screen reader, so that people who are using a keyboard can navigate your site, it comes down to establishing relationships with maybe one engineer who's going to slowly start to implement that into their code. When it comes to the stuff that I'm talking about here, it's just those baby steps in, building relationships with other people potentially in your company, outside of your company, who have done this, and maybe leveraging them. So yeah, I guess it's time. It's showing quick wins when you can, right? Maybe not trying to tackle everything, but just any quick win that shows why this is important. And then just basically baby steps until you can do something really huge and impactful because you have that buy-in.
Thank you.
Thank you. And hi, Vanvisa. She was one of my students. So nice to see you here.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your program. She designs, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so, so She Designs, I would say, was created, even on our site, this is what it says, out of a necessity to diversify, the tech space, because not many, women and women of color are really in that space. Only until recently, there's definitely been a little bit of a spike, but we are still outnumbered. And so that is why Sheree Gibbs, who's also a Googler, we both joined Google at the same time. She started the company and brought me on as one of the early instructors. And so we actually just started our mentorship sign up. So if you go to the site, I'm actually going to plug the site in right now. Shameless plug. You can check us out. And we offer an immersive UX course, a variety of different resources as well. So definitely check us out. And I think the best thing to say about She Designs is it's a community. So in the way that Vanvisa is here, we're just constantly creating this amazing cohort of women who just support each other in tech. So it's really fun.
Great, thank you for doing this. Actually, it's really so exciting because I know how difficult to find the community and feel inside this community. Yeah, especially
Exactly.
who just moved in, you say, not so much time ago. So it's definitely very helpful.
Yeah. It's not often, it's also just good to have a safe space with with women who've gone through things that you've had, and just, we tend to just push that down, right? And just to continue pushing forward. So it's just good to also just have a support system, so.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I think we don't have questions anymore. So thank you again, Katasi, for answering those questions and for the really amazing presentation.
Of course.
It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. This is awesome.
Yeah, so this concludes the session, and we have more sessions that will start at 7 at 8 p.m. too. Okay. So people join.
Yeah, I'll definitely join. Then should I stay or do I leave? How do I?
Yeah, I'm going to just close so you can.
Okay, perfect.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.